The path to redemption is often paved with obsidian, sharp and dark, requiring a steady heart to navigate the shadows. Join our latest exploration of the human condition and the difficult choices that lead us toward the light. Click subscribe now and walk the path of truth with us.
The morning my daughter was rushed to the hospital, I was pruning the rose bushes in my backyard. My phone buzzed on the patio table, and I almost didn't answer it. I almost let it go to voicemail. I think about that sometimes, how close I came to missing those first few seconds that changed everything. Instead, I wiped my hands on my jeans and picked it up, and my son-in-law's voice came through before I even said hello. "There's been an accident," he said. "Claire's been taken to Mercy General." He didn't say our Claire. He didn't say your daughter. He said it the way you'd report a car parked in the wrong spot. Matter of fact. Clipped. And at the time, I told myself he was in shock. I told myself people handle fear in different ways. I grabbed my keys and drove 40 minutes to that hospital with my heart in my throat, rehearsing every prayer I'd learned since childhood. What I found when I arrived was my daughter in a coma with a fractured skull and 2 broken ribs, hooked to machines that breathed for her. The doctor told me she had been sideswiped by a truck that ran a red light on Carmichael Avenue, and that the next 72 hours were critical. I sat beside her bed and held her hand and talked to her the way you talk to someone who can still hear you, because I refused to believe anything else. My son-in-law stood in the corner of that room with his arms crossed, scrolling through his phone. I noticed it. I filed it away somewhere quiet inside me and told myself, again, that grief looks different on different people. My daughter had chosen this man. She loved him. She had been with him for 9 years, married for 6. I had walked her down the aisle myself, had shaken his hand at the altar and looked him in the eye and believed he would take care of her. I was 63 years old and I had spent a lifetime learning to give people the benefit of the doubt. By the second day, the doctors were cautiously optimistic. Her brain activity was strong. The swelling was reducing. They told us she could likely hear us, and that familiar voices were important. I read to her from the detective novels she loved. I told her about the roses in my garden, about the cardinals that had been coming to the feeder all week. I told her that her old dog, Winston, was staying with me, and that he kept sleeping in front of the door like he was waiting for her. My son-in-law visited for a total of 40 minutes on day 2. I know because I counted. On day 3, I arrived at the hospital at 8 in the morning to find him already there, but not at her bedside. He was in the hallway outside her room, speaking in a low voice on his phone. He saw me coming and turned slightly away, dropped his voice further. By the time I reached him, he had already hung up. "Any change?" I asked. "Same," he said, and went back inside before me. I want to be clear about something. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher. I coached baseball for 20 of those years. I believe, fundamentally, in people. I believed in my son-in-law. But there is something that happens when you've spent decades watching young people closely. You start to read the spaces between words, the hesitations, the angles of the body, the way someone's eyes move when they're protecting something. His eyes never went to her when he was in that room. They went to the monitors. They went to the door. They went to the window. Everywhere except to her face. On day 4, I came back to the hospital after dark. I hadn't planned to. I had gone home, eaten a sandwich I barely tasted, and sat in my armchair for an hour trying to read. Then something I couldn't name pulled me back up, pulled me out to my car, pulled me down the highway in the dark. I told myself I just wanted to sit with her a little longer. What I found was her room empty of visitors and a hospital social worker named Patricia at the nurse's station, reviewing paperwork with a small frown on her face. She looked up when she saw me and seemed uncertain for just a moment. "Just long enough. Mr. Hargrove?" she said. I was actually hoping to speak with the family soon. She told me, carefully, that a representative from Broadfield Financial Services had contacted the hospital that afternoon, requesting documentation of Claire's current medical status. Specifically, documentation that would confirm she was in a coma and unable to manage her own affairs. I sat down very slowly in the plastic chair beside the nurse's station. Who made that request? I asked. She looked at her paperwork. The next of kin on file, she said. Her husband. I drove home in a kind of terrible stillness. I don't remember traffic or stoplights or anything in between the hospital parking lot and my own driveway. I sat in the car for a long time before going inside. I'm not ashamed to say I cried. Not because I knew everything yet I didn't, but because something in me had shifted permanently, the way ground shifts before an earthquake, and I understood that the world I was standing in was not the world I had thought it was. That night, I called my daughter's best friend, a woman named Donna who had been in Claire's life since college. I didn't tell her everything. I just asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she had noticed anything unusual about my son-in-law lately, anything different in how he was acting with Claire before the accident. The pause before Donna answered lasted about 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, I understood several things. He's been different for a while, she said, finally. I didn't want to say anything because Claire seemed okay, and I didn't want to cause trouble. But there have been some late nights. Some trips where the explanations didn't quite line up. I asked Claire about it a couple of months ago, and she said she was handling it. Donna paused again. She said she was documenting it. Documenting it. I spent the next morning thinking about what that meant. My daughter was a methodical person. She had a system for everything, a spreadsheet for the grocery budget, a binder for medical records, color-coded tabs in her planner. If she was documenting something, there was a file somewhere. There were records. She had been building a case before any of this happened. I called the hospital before noon and spoke to the attending physician, a careful, measured woman named Dr. Okafor. I told her I was concerned about financial decisions being made regarding my daughter's care and assets without my knowledge. I asked whether there was a way to ensure that no outside parties received documentation of her condition without my being informed. Dr. Okafor listened and said she would note my concern and flag any further inquiries. Then I drove to my daughter's house with the spare key she had given me years ago. I want to be clear. I was not snooping. I was not going through her things out of suspicion or spite or curiosity. I was her father. And somewhere in that house, I believed, was proof that my daughter had known something was wrong, had been quietly, carefully preparing for the possibility that her husband was not who she had believed him to be. And if that proof existed, I needed to find it before someone else did. The house was quiet. My son-in-law's car was not in the driveway. I let myself in through the side door and stood for a moment in the kitchen where I had eaten 100 Sunday dinners, where I had watched my daughter cook and laugh and build a life I had been so proud of. I found what I was looking for in 40 minutes. It was not hidden dramatically. My daughter was smarter than drama. It was a thumb drive in a small zippered pocket inside a blue organizer in her home office, labeled in her handwriting, April backup. I took it. I also took a photograph that was sitting face down on her desk, which I thought was strange enough to notice. When I turned it over, it was their wedding photo. I set it back face down the way I found it and left. At home, I called my nephew Marcus, who works in cybersecurity for a firm in Austin. He drove up that evening, and we sat at my kitchen table and opened the drive together. What was on it was not complicated. It was thorough. My daughter had been building that file for 4 months. There were screenshots of bank transfers, small at first, then larger, from their joint account into a separate account she did not recognize. There were photographs she had taken on her phone of documents she had found in his briefcase, including a lease agreement for an apartment on the east side of the city signed 6 months ago. There were text screenshots. I will not describe them in detail, except to say that they removed any remaining ambiguity about what my son-in-law had been doing and with whom. But the last folder on the drive was the one that stopped me cold. It was labeled Meridian. Inside were records from their financial advisor account statements, transfer histories, a trail of transactions that my daughter had clearly spent weeks reconstructing. The short version, as Marcus walked me through it, was this. My son-in-law had been systematically shifting assets from their shared investment portfolio into a separate account that was technically in both their names, but had been structured to allow him to liquidate it unilaterally. The total was just over $400,000. He had been positioning himself for months to leave to walk away clean with the money and leave my daughter with very little, except that my daughter had found out. And then, before she could act, a truck ran a red light on Carmichael Avenue. I want to be careful here. I am not saying it wasn't an accident. The police report was clear. The truck driver had run the light, and the liability was his. But I sat at my kitchen table that night with Marcus, and I thought about the timing, and I thought about the financial request to the hospital, and I thought about how quickly my son-in-law seemed to be moving, and I made a decision. I picked up the phone, and I called a lawyer. Her name was Evelyn Marsh, and she came highly recommended by a colleague of Marcus's. I met with her the next morning, and I laid out everything. The drive, the documents, the hospital inquiry, all of it. She was quiet through most of it. She asked precise questions. When I finished, she looked at her notepad for a moment, and then at me. "Your daughter put this together herself?" she said. "Yes." She knew what she was building. "Yes." Evelyn Marsh nodded slowly. "Then, we need to make sure no one touches those accounts before she wakes up," she said. "And we need to move quickly." That afternoon, Evelyn filed for an emergency order to freeze the Meridian account pending investigation of potential financial abuse. By the end of the day, my son-in-law could not touch a single dollar. The moment the order landed, I'm told, he was on the phone within the hour. The hospital legal department fielded a call from him demanding to know the status of his wife's medical proxy. He didn't get the answer he was looking for. He called me that evening. I answered. He asked me what was going on. I told him that I was making sure my daughter's interests were protected. There was a silence on the line that told me everything about what he understood was happening. "She's my wife," he said. "She is," I said, "and she put a great deal of time into making sure you couldn't forget that." I hung up. On day 9, something changed. I was sitting with my daughter in the afternoon, reading to her from a Patricia Cornwell novel she had been halfway through before the accident, when Dr. Okafor came in with a different look on her face. Not the careful neutral she usually wore, but something quieter. She asked if I could step out for a moment. When I came back 10 minutes later, my daughter was looking at me. Not the distant half-focus of a person just emerging from sedation. She was looking at me the way she had looked at me when she was 8 years old and had broken my watch and was trying to figure out how to tell me. Direct. A little afraid. Completely present. "Hey, Dad," she said. Her voice was rough and small. I sat down in the chair beside her, and I took her hand, and I did not say anything for a long time. Dr. Okafor told me later that Claire had been showing signs of responsiveness for 2 days. She had been working with the medical team quietly, because she had asked them to. She had been lucid enough to make that request to ask that I not be told yet, because she needed to know how much time had passed and what had happened before she surfaced. She needed to know who had come to visit and who hadn't. She had been listening. For 2 days, my daughter had lain in that hospital bed with her eyes closed, and she had listened. She knew that her husband had visited a total of 3 times in 9 days. She knew that I had been there every day, sometimes twice. She had heard me reading to her. She had heard me tell her about Winston waiting at the door. She told me later that she had cried on one of those nights and had been terrified I would notice the tears, but I had been reaching for a glass of water and missed it. She had heard me, on day 4, come in late and sit beside her and not read, not talk, just sit. She said that was the moment she knew I was starting to understand. "I found the drive," I told her. She closed her eyes briefly. "I figured you would," she said. I hoped. We talked for a long time that afternoon. She told me things she had been carrying for months the moment she found the first transfer. The week she spent convinced she was wrong. The slow, terrible process of confirming that she wasn't. She told me about the lease, about the texts, about sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning building that file because she didn't know yet what she was going to do with it, only that she needed to have it. She had been planning to consult a lawyer the week after the accident. "I kept thinking I had more time," she said. "I kept thinking I could fix it quietly. I kept thinking there was a version of this where it didn't have to blow everything up. She looked at the window. I loved him for a long time. I didn't have anything useful to say to that. I just kept holding her hand. What happened next moved faster than I expected, because Evelyn Marsh was very good at her job. With my daughter now conscious and able to speak on her own behalf, the picture shifted considerably. Claire's own testimony, combined with the documentation she had collected, gave Evelyn what she needed to pursue civil action for financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The frozen account remained frozen. My son-in-law retained his own attorney. He attempted, in the first week, to present himself as a devoted husband who had simply been managing their finances responsibly during a crisis. This argument ran into significant difficulties when the lease agreement, the bank records, and the text screenshots entered the proceedings. He also attempted to visit Claire at the hospital twice. She declined both times. She was calm about it in a way that I found quietly devastating to witness. Not cold, not angry, just certain. She had made her decision before she ever went into that hospital. She had made it sitting at her kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a thumb drive in her hand. One afternoon during her recovery, while I was sitting with her and she was strong enough to be irritated by the hospital food and annoyed by the scratchy blankets, which I took as a very good sign, she asked me something I didn't expect. "How did you know?" she said. "What made you go back that night? The night you found out about the financial request?" I thought about it. I thought about the rose bushes and the phone call and the 40-minute drive and the plastic chair at the nurse's station. "I don't know exactly," I said. "I think I had been watching him for days and something wasn't adding up. The way he stood in your room, the way he never looked at your face." I paused. "You know, when you were small, you had a way of getting very still when something was wrong. You thought if you stayed still, I wouldn't notice." I always noticed. She smiled at that. It was the first time she had smiled and I had to look away for a moment. "He forgot that you were paying attention," she said. "He forgot that you had a father," I said. The investigation uncovered the full scope of what he had done. The $400,000 in the Meridian account was only part of it. There had been additional transfers made to accounts tied to a business entity he had created without her knowledge, a shell structure, Marcus told me, that had been set up with the intention of sheltering assets in the event of a divorce. The total, once everything was reconstructed, was closer to $600,000. The DA's office opened a separate inquiry based on Evelyn's referral. I will not get ahead of what is still being resolved, but I will say that my son-in-law is no longer living in my daughter's house, and he has not touched a single dollar of what he tried to take. My daughter came home on a Tuesday in early November. I drove her myself. Winston lost his mind at the door, jumping, crying, spinning in circles the way only old dogs do when something they've been hoping for finally happens. She sat down on the kitchen floor and let him climb all over her, and she buried her face in his neck. And I stood in the doorway and let her have that moment. That evening we sat on her back porch with tea, and she asked me to tell her everything I had done, in order, from the beginning. So I did. I told her about the roses and the phone call and the 40-minute drive, about the social worker and the blank look that lasted just long enough, about the thumb drive in the blue organizer, about Marcus at my kitchen table that night, and Evelyn Marsh the next morning, and the moment the freeze order landed and my son-in-law picked up his phone. She listened to all of it, without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. "I thought I was going to have to do all of it alone," she said. "I thought I had to handle it quietly, by myself, and not tell you until it was over, because I didn't want you to worry. You've been protecting me since you were 12 years old," I said. "You used to clean up your messes before I got home so I wouldn't stress about it." She laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and sudden. "The one I've been hearing my whole life. You always knew anyway," she said. "Always," I said. "There is something I want to say about all of it, not about him, not about what he did, but about her. About who my daughter is and who she has been through this. She did not fall apart. She did not become bitter. She was angry. Yes, deeply and legitimately angry. And she let herself feel that fully without apology. But she was also, From the first day she was coherent enough to speak, already thinking about what came next, already thinking about the house, about her work, about the life she was going to rebuild. She asked to speak with her financial advisor from the hospital. She was reviewing documents before she was off the IV. She told me once, when she was maybe 15 and going through something at school I can't even remember now, that she never wanted to be the kind of person who stayed down. She said she had decided, at some point, that getting knocked down was something that happened to everyone, and the only variable was how long you stayed there. She stayed down for 9 days, and she wasn't even really down. She was listening. I think about the man who stood in the corner of that hospital room scrolling through his phone, and I think about what he believed he was looking at. A problem being managed, an obstacle to a plan that had been in motion for months, a woman who was, for the moment, unable to stop what was happening. He did not know her. He had spent 9 years in her orbit, and he did not know her. He had looked at his wife and seen someone he could outmaneuver, and the catastrophic failure of his imagination was in not understanding that the woman in that bed was always, in every circumstance, 10 steps ahead. She had left me a thumb drive in a zippered pocket of a blue organizer. She had labeled it April Backup because April was the month she had started building the file, and because she understood, somewhere in the back of her mind, that a backup was exactly what it might one day become. She had trusted me to find it. I did not let her down. Winston is back home with her now. The roses in my garden came through the winter better than I expected. I visit on Sundays and we have dinner, and she beats me at cards and I complain about it the way I always have, and she tells me I should have learned to play better by now. The house is quiet, and it's hers, and the paperwork is moving toward a conclusion that I trust Evelyn Marsh to see through to the end. Last Sunday, as I was leaving, my daughter stood in the doorway and called after me. "Hey, Dad," she said. I turned around. "Thank you," she said, "for going back that night, for not waiting." I stood there in the driveway in the November cold, and I thought about 63 years of living and every decision I had ever second-guessed, every moment I had hesitated, every time I had told myself to wait and see and give it time and not make assumptions. "I wasn't going to wait," I said. "Not for you." She nodded once, the way she does when something is settled, and went back inside. I drove home in the dark with my hands steady on the wheel, and I thought about the word father and what it has meant to me across the whole length of my life. Not the title, not the legal fact of it, but the daily practice of showing up and paying attention and refusing to look away even when looking away would have been easier. He forgot that she had a father. That was the only mistake he made that really mattered. Everything else, the accounts, the apartment, the shell company, all of it, that was just logistics. The real error, the one that undid all of it, was standing in the corner of that hospital room, with his arms crossed, and his phone in his hand, and his eyes anywhere but on the woman in that bed, and not noticing that the man in the chair beside her was watching. Was cataloching. Was, in the slow and quiet way of someone who has spent 31 years paying close attention to things other people dismiss. Understanding everything. My daughter knew I would find the drive. She had counted on it. She was right too.